The strange, on the strange, the Hegel not taught in your philosophy class. Hegel's concept of God is neither Judeo nor Christian. For Hegel, God does not exist outside of his creation, but rather is immanently present within it. Before creation, God could not know himself and so needed creation so that it could reflect back on him, thus allowing God to know himself through the other. It is through the ongoing process of God continuously coming to know more of himself that, at the end of history, he becomes fully self-actualized. Hence, Hegel's logic is the idea of God, the in itself, the Father. His philosophy of nature is God expressing himself, the for itself, the Son. And his philosophy of spirit is Geist, the in and for itself, the Hegelian Holy Spirit that, as absolute idea, returns back to the Father, completing the circle. Hegel states in the Phenomenology that this dialectic, quote, is the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having its end also as its beginning, and only by being worked out to its end is it actual, unquote. For Hegel, God not only exists in creation, he needs his creation, man, to give him identity, so that he can realize himself and hence be fully realized. History, then, is that circle that repeats itself, moving forward in time, until all the elements of God in nature are collected together and reformed at a single point at the end of history, what Teilhard de Chardin called the Omega point. Far from being transcendent, this God needs his creation to drive history forward so that he may become fully actualized. Hence, God is immanent in the minds of men. This redefines the transcendent God, I am, into the immanent God who is always becoming. In this theosophy, God is not fully actualized until the march of history is completed. Man can accelerate God's becoming fully actualized act by policies of continuous change or even perpetual revolution. Familiar to us in the language of Marxism, the dialectical process reopened an ancient portal that, as Eric Voegelin pointed out, immanentizes the eschaton. Clearly, Hegel's Trinity is not Christian. Many Germans in Hegel's day were well aware of this. Hegel's theosophy looked to the Priesia Theologia, the idea of a fundamental sameness in the identity of all religions from an original religion that lies beneath the superficial differences of contemporary religions, while pursuing the Philosophia Perennis, an original, quote, unconscious wisdom struggling to transcend its purely sensuous form, unquote, that, quote, all previous systems of thought aim at and partially unveil, unquote. Because Hegel's science only concerns itself with the, quote, recovery and perfection of pre-reflective thought forms granted to mankind from time immemorial, unquote. True philosophy is not creative, but rather constitutes an, quote, adequate expression of the primordial wisdom, unquote, that only becomes fully reconstituted in absolute act at the end of time. While this may sound a little strange, even New Age, be patient. There will be a point to this. On the strange, redefining God has political consequences. It is in the context of Hegel's drive to create a new Volksreligion, actually a replacement cosmological order, that the Hegelian God, the one who is in a constant state of dialectical becoming, and who only fully manifests at the end of history, with the help of his creation, is to be understood. The effect of placing God in creation, while also dependent on it, is that it converts the transcendent God of the above into an immanent God that exists in creation. In a Judeo-Christian culture, this shift can have dramatic effects, especially when unrecognized and unperceived. The God, I am, of Judeo-Christianity is the eternal now that exists outside of creation and hence outside of time and space. In a refutation of Teilhard de Chardin along Hegelian lines, Dr. Smith notes that the act of placing God in creation replaces, quote, the axis mundi by the arrow of time, or, more precisely, by the trajectory of evolution. In the language of geometry, Teilhard rotated the axis through 90 degrees. Unquote. Arguably, and at the source code level, the transition from I am to becoming redefines God. Cambridge divinity scholar Ryan Haker agrees that such a move creates a, quote, new conception of the God-man Jesus Christ, which constitutes a new Christian conception of man. Human nature is affirmed to participate in divine reason and divine grace. Unquote. As Haker reasons, although he might state it more positively, Hegel alchemically subordinates God to the dialectical processes of becoming that denies the very laws of identity that permit God to declare I am. This point is not offered for theological reflection. At the cultural level, when a Judeo-Christian society operates on the assumption that its norms reflect the cultural standard when they actually do not, things can break down in seemingly inexplicable ways. As it relates to this discussion, the realignment of God closely aligns with the trajectory of the dialectical materialism of Marxism. This is the context in which to understand the interfaith movement. In just the way Haker explains the Hegelian negation of God, the interfaith line of effort likewise serves as a vehicle on which a Judeo-Christian culture can be positioned for dialectical negation as well. Lenin was well aware of the benefits of placing religious groups and processes leading to democratic socialism through negation. As leftist campaigns like social justice arise out of interfaith lines of effort, the interfaith movement should not be ignored simply because it arises out of the religious sector. Eric Voegelin was among the first to bring attention to the esoteric strangeness of Hegel's cosmology to the English-speaking world, admitting that he didn't really understand Hegel until he found out that Hegel was a known Gnostic. Voegelin acknowledged that his comprehension of Hegel was incident to his realization that, working his way through Neoplatonism, Hegel was a Hermeticist. Quote, Hegel's program of magic, I would now say, belongs to the continuous history of modern Hermeticism since the 15th century. Unquote. Voegelin was not speaking metaphorically when speaking of Hegel's magic, recognizing in Hegel's writing an intellectual alchemy that spurred Voegelin to write On Hegel, A Study in Sorcery, in 1972. Voegelin was speaking about alchemy. As Glenn Magee would demonstrate years later, Hegel purposely patterned his dialectic on alchemical formulas, even adopting its language in areas of his writing. As discussions on this topic can become painfully arcane quickly, a few simplified extracts from Magee will suffice. Quote, like the alchemists, Hegel's philosophical project is to free spirit from nature. Just as alchemists believe that God is slumbering in matter and must be released by man, so Hegel holds that nature is petrified intelligence, but that God does not remain petrified and moribund. However, the stones cry out and lift themselves up to spirit. Hegel believes that it is in philosophical thought that God and the world are completed, exactly as the elders believed that man was Redeemer, who must save nature and God. Hegel himself has claimed that the three materials of mercury, sulfur, and salt represent the three moments of the concept, just as each stage of the alchemical opus dies by another. Each moment of the dialectic is negated and is superseded by another. Each moment contains the seed of the absolute, which blooms in the end. Hegel's dialectic is a circle. Idea issues in nature, which issues in spirit, and spirit returns to idea in the form of absolute spirit or philosophical thought. A systematic parallel can be drawn between each aspect of the alchemical opus. In Hegel's philosophical project, in alchemy, each metal was said to contain a seed of gold that could be made to sprout and blossom. At the same time, The alchemist was expected to purify himself, or the process would not work. In this we can see an analogy to the purification function of the phenomenology itself. In the phenomenological crucible, spirit is separated from its impurities and, literally, perfected. As we have seen, the seed of absolute spirit is present in every flawed, imperfect form that spirit takes. The work of this purification has happened, in part, through the historical process, but Hegel provides the final, secret ingredient necessary to synthesize absolute spirit. Hegel placed the historical forms of spirit into his alembic, and, through the fire of dialectic, has caused them to reorganize into a form that reveals the necessity within their apparent contingency. Unquote. Hegel's dialectic is patterned after the alchemical process that seeks to transition base metals into gold. Coughlin was not as academically tempered in his treatment of Hegel as was Meiji. Coughlin referred to Hegel's phenomenology as a grimoire, a book of spells and incantations dedicated to the, quote, violent destruction of reality, unquote, through, quote, sleights of hand, unquote, intent on, quote, replacing the first reality of experience by the second reality of imaginative construction, and then endowing the imaginary reality with the appearance of truth by letting it absorb pieces of the first reality, unquote. Vogelin's second reality is Pieper's pseudo-reality. Coughlin recognized that Hegel's dialectic was an intellectual form of alchemy, that it is an actual alchemical formula. In conjunction with the observation that Hegel's dialectic justifies the will to power, the libido dominante, Coughlin warned that Hegel's dialectic is dangerous because it spurs a delusional form of megalomania. The problem with the dialectic is that, like alchemy, it presumes to make something out of nothing. Just as gold cannot be made from lead, so too the Federal Reserve cannot really make money out of debt. Negation is not addition. Coughlin declared Hegel a sorcerer because his metaphysic successfully mainstreamed alchemy. While Coughlin was right, Marx recognized it much earlier. For a more detailed explanation of how the Hegelian dialectic is patterned after alchemical formulas, see Appendix B. On the strange, Marx defined by Hegel. A project in itself, there are sound reasons to know that Marx was fully aware of this phenomenon and tipped his hat to it, and maybe more. Less than 10 years after Hegel died, as Marx was wrapping his mind around the Hegelian cosmology, understanding it along the lines of Meiji and Coughlin, he recognized it for what it was and what it could do for the imaginator who embraced it. The Hegelian dialectic, being an alchemical formula, cannot helically raise something to a new and better version of itself through negation, because negation reduces. If one successfully opposes an apple, thesis, with 1/4 not an apple, antithesis, one does not get a better version of the apple, a 1 1/4 apple, synthesis, but rather the apple has been reduced by 1/4 to 3/4 of the original apple. The dialectic is unreasonable, violates the most basic laws of identity, not to mention math, and is irrational. The dialectic is a well-crafted engine of destruction that reduces thought at both the individual and group levels to meaninglessness. It induces nihilism. But just think of an imaginator who could form a whole movement exuberantly committed to the illusion of making 1 1/4 apples, all the while reducing all apples to nothingness, 1/4 negation at a time. Then picture a political opposition to that movement that fails to recognize either the engine or the equation. As Marx was formulating his critical philosophy, he understood it to be a hostile nihilist rebellion against God that envisioned the destruction of Western civilization. Quote, I wish to avenge myself against the one who rules above. Thus, heaven I forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell. Unquote. Karl Marx. Quote, "If there is a something which devours, I'll leap within it. Though I bring the world to ruins, the world which bulks between me and the abyss, I will smash to pieces with my enduring curses." Unquote. Coughlin, Karl Marx, 1839. Hardly recognized and never discussed, this line of thinking runs like a thread through Marxism to this day, possibly in equal measure an homage to Marx and an expression of his own view. The Gramsci Marxist, Saul Alinsky, keeps Marx's vision current for today's left. Quote, "Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical, from all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom. Lucifer." Unquote. Saul Alinsky, 1971. Quote, Alinsky, "If there is an afterlife, and I have anything to say about it, I will unreservedly choose to go to hell." Playboy, "Why?" Alinsky, "Hell would be heaven for me. All my life I've been with the have-nots. Over here, if you're a have-not, you're short of dough. If you're a have-not in hell, you're short of virtue. Once I get into hell, I'll start organizing the have-nots over there." Playboy, "Why them?" Alinsky, "They're my kind of people." Unquote. Saul Alinsky, Playboy, March, 1972. From Marx to Alinsky, the worldview expressed here is one of people who would rather be rulers in hell than subjects in heaven. When analyzing the left today, the hate-filled nihilist drive for destruction should always be understood as a paired set with Vogelin's libido dominante, will to power, that should never be left out of any analysis of the left. Why do they want to destroy? Because that's what they want to do. Why? Because they want to. Why? There is no why. They just are. Nothing follows. The circular helix in the interfaith. Function follows form, especially in the Platonic arrangements. A typological form emerges from the Hegelian metaphysic that, when recognized, provides an operational awareness to see beyond specific events to their trajectory and strategic design. For example, the idea that history is a circuit moving helically forward in history is an alchemical formula that drives the dialectic that in modern parlance is imperfectly expressed as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. A recurring theme of the left. While Hegel's expression may seem dated to today's ear, quote, "I stick to this idea that the spirit of time has given the order to move forward. This order has been obeyed. This being is moving forward irresistibly, like an armored and compact phalanx, and with a movement as imperceptible as the sun's, through good and bad roads. Countless light troops, against him and for him, flank him everywhere." Unquote. Alinsky's articulation strikes a recognizable chord. Quote, "History is a relay of revolutions. The torch of idealism is carried by the revolutionary group until this group becomes an establishment, and then quietly the torch is put down to wait until a new revolutionary group picks it up for the next leg of the run. Thus the revolutionary cycle goes on." Unquote. The interfaith dimension. As noted, Vogelin recognized that Hegel's immanentized God, quote, "immanentizes the eschaton," unquote, and, in so doing, transitions the Church's focus from heaven to earth. Seeking God at the end of history through the building up and perfecting of His creation, heaven on earth. Undermining transcendence, and hence the Judeo-Christian concept of God, and immanentized faith is just a few semantical turns from Marxism. Think this is a stretch? Not if one follows dialectically inspired theologians, like Teilhard de Chardin, when saying in 1952, quote, "As I love to say, the synthesis of the Christian God of the above and the Marxist God of the forward, behold, that is the only God whom henceforth we can adore in spirit and in truth." Unquote. Under Hegel, the state replaces God because God manifests himself in the state. This, in itself, explains the embedded statism of the interfaith movement. In this process, justice transitions to social justice, which is repackaged Marxism, repackaged by Marxists. Social justice is justice administered by socialists. Social justice has been the primary mission of the interfaith movement. This would be a Christianity that Marx would exploit and that the left co-opts. As far back as Lenin, the utility of allowing clergy to participate in party activities was recognized. In an article that began by affirming that Marxist scientific socialism remains permanently hostile to all religions, Lenin insisted that priests be allowed to visibly participate in the Social Democrats' activities. While Lenin focused on the personal contradictions the priest put himself in by doing so, the faith-negating contradictions his actions likewise had on the faithful was not lost on the reader. Does it matter that the elite Protestant theologian Karl Barth considered Hegel to be the Protestant Aquinas at a time when he was on the speaking circuit with prominent Jesuit theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, as he aligned his theology with Hegel's? While this was going on, organizations such as the World Council of Churches and the New Theologians were promoting similar concepts of social justice to those friendly to Moscow. In America, Marxist publishing tracts presented United Front publications like The Protestant and Fight magazine, the official publication of the American League Against War and Fascism. The American League Against War and Fascism was put out by Social Action, the National Council of Methodist Youth, beginning in 1933. While more will be said later on the American League, it is enough here to note that it, too, was a united front formed at the direction of the Comintern by a prominent minister, the General Secretary of the Methodist Federation of Social Services, Reverend Harry F. Ward. He was also the founding director of the American Civil Liberties Union. Carrying the United Front concept forward, the interfaith movement retains its role to this day. Organized along United Front lines, using the language of community organizing while dropping the United Front designation, the Gramsci Marxist Saul Alinsky established the principal interfaith organization in the United States by founding the Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF, in 1940. In archetype form, the interfaith movement follows Hegelian form in promoting a convergence of faith into statist constructs in pursuit of the Praetia Theologia. To this day, the principal interfaith organizations in the National Capital Region are organs of the IAF. As a united front, as far back as the early 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood recognized the need to form alliances with the left. In the later 1980s, the Islamic movement in America, the IMOA, recognized the desiccating effects postmodern narratives were wreaking on Western religions and decided to penetrate and co-opt interfaith movements. In 1989, Shamim Siddiqui wrote a treatise laying out the strategy in Methodology of Dawah Ilallah in American Perspective, which proved successful enough that the International Institute of Islamic Thought, the IIIT, a named Muslim Brotherhood front group, stepped up the effort, producing the instructional text Interfaith Dialogue, a Guide for Muslims, in 2012. As it happens, social justice narratives are not new to the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1949, Sayyid Qutb recognized the co-opting force of the social justice meme when writing Social Justice in Islam. As will be discussed, it was through the churches that the Comintern looked to penetrate the African American community in the 1930s. Black Lives Matter is an example of a united front effort shared between the left and the Muslim Brotherhood that has a clear Comintern pedigree. While Hegel's influence on the Judeo-Christian pillars of Western civilization have been crippling in their own right, it also drives the left's programs directed at religion as well. The dialectical nature of the interfaith movement makes it ripe for exploitation by the left. The dialectical drive for convergence. Notions of Praetia Theologia and Philosophia Perennis include the idea that there was a time before race, gender, and nationality, that sex was contained in an androgyne unity of opposites. If the process of moving to the perfected endpoint of history concerns the actualization of the perfected original form, then the process itself will demand a convergence of all things. Think, for example, of the internationalist movements associated with the left, the Communist International, Comintern, not to mention a global caliphate. Perfectible futures that are equated with convergence demand that individual group, religious, and national identity be converged, negated, as particular identities in order to realize the perfected universal form they will all find themselves sublated into. This suppression, or sublimation, or negation also includes the convergence of sex, genderism, race, religion, interfaith, and national identity, globalism, and forced mass migrations that are destroying national identity. From the interfaith movement to the radicalizing activities directed at race, gender, and the border, the dialectical engines are pervasively acting upon America in the form of operational plans from the left, oriented towards the negation of America through the destruction of identity that can be purely sourced to the alchemical Hegel. For example, the multicultural concept of the other, antithesis, is positioned against the American, thesis, in a dialectical negation that claims to helically raise mankind to a new, improved global citizenship, synthesis, when in fact the only thing that results is an impoverished national identity, like Venezuela.